Today's the feast of St. Albert the Great, and he is truly an amazing and very interesting saint. He was, as a young boy, he had always been quite smart and talented, and also very curious about the world around him, which led him to always continue to be learning things. It was said of him that from an early age that he would get involved in things that would oftentimes be a little bit worrisome to people like his parents and things like that. But it was always to learn more. One time, it is said that he had a friend of his tie a rope around him, and they walked to a cliffside, and the friend held the rope and lowered St. Albert down over the cliff. And the whole purpose of it was because he knew that there were eagles nesting down below the cliff, and he wanted to learn about what it was that they did with the nest and how what it all looked like and everything like that, and to see it all up close. And that curiosity and that eagerness to learn continued to follow him out throughout his life, and it soon became apparent he was destined things in the way of learning, in the way of academia, and in the sort of the world was his to take in the way of higher education and sciences to apply himself. And so this is what it seemed that he was destined to do. But however, at a certain point, he had been praying about his vocation, what he was supposed to do with his life, what God wanted him to do. And he had begun to have thoughts about a religious vocation off and on, and then he heard Blessed Jordan of Saxony, the successor to St. Dominic, preaching one time, and soon he became enthralled by this idea of becoming a Dominican. And then a little while afterwards, he began to have doubts and temptations against it, wondering if it was not that it was it going to be something that he wanted to do, but rather would he be able to persevere in it? This is how he found himself tempted. He didn't think that he was going to be able to withstand that life of a religious, and so he began to think, perhaps I should leave. And he showed up to Mass that day, and Blessed Jordan was preaching again. And in that sermon, he preached about that very topic, about how it is that when a young man desires after the religious state and with all his heart, and then begins to, it is the devil who will try to discourage him not by means of seeing if he would be to question if he would be able to persevere in such a life, and that in reality that it is by God's grace that one can continue day after day in any pursuit of doing God's will, and so that they should follow after it. With that, Albert knew this was truly meant for his ears to hear, and that he was destined to become a Dominican, and he desired wholeheartedly to soon enter in that order. One obstacle stood in his way was his own uncle. His uncle, who was a man of great influence and had seen the talents of Albert and desired for him to really excel in the world of business and of science. And he came and tried to come and convince him not to go into the Dominican order. Now, for us, now in today's world, that seems very strange. Why would a Catholic man, a man who, by all accounts, would be at least somewhat God-fearing in his life, try to dissuade a man from becoming a Dominican? Well, you have to remember, at that time, that idea of what we call the mendicant orders, the orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, those who had a serious active apostolate while also maintaining an aspect of cloistered life, that this was a novel idea. It was seen to be safe if one wanted to become a priest attached to the cathedral, or one wanted to enter the Benedictines or things like that. But this idea of this new startup order and this weird sort of in-between active and contemplative life, it was unheard of, and many people thought that it was not fitting of people, especially people of a higher status in society, to join them. And so his uncle really tried to persuade him elsewise, but Albert would have none of it. His mind was set, his heart was set on God, and he knew that the path of the Dominicans was truly his. And so he entered in, and he began to earnestly apply himself in all the ways of his studies, eventually attaining a doctorate in theology. Now, it is interesting with St. Albert the Great, we see in him not one who was just merely brilliant in the things of religion, but he had a brilliance in all subjects. It said of St. Albert the Great that it was much like Solomon, that he had indeed prayed for wisdom. He had prayed for the gift of wisdom. And it was Our Lady that appeared to St. Albert the Great and promised him that wisdom would be his. He would be wise in all things, and but so that he never thought it to be from himself. One day, before he died, she would come and take it away from him, so that he would always know that his wisdom truly came from above. And with that, a man who was already truly gifted began to excel in all aspects of learning. It is while he was in Cologne teaching that he designed the Cologne Cathedral. At time when he was in the Dominicans, we don't know exactly when, that he designed a machine that moved about and it crawled across the floor and it danced around, and it was essentially what we would consider to be a robot. And it took him years and years, nearly 30 years, to build this thing. And when he finally completed it and had it moving about, a companion of his came into the room and saw it on the ground and immediately assumed that it was possessed by the devil and stomped it into a million pieces. Albert looked at him and said, "What have you done? You destroyed my machine." And the man said, "Well, I thought it was possessed." And Albert said, "What you have destroyed, I will never have the time left in my life to be able to rebuild." He was so far advanced in that way of natural sciences in that way. But moreover, it was the application of his knowledge to things of importance of religion, defense of the faith and defense against errors that he wrote to great extent about. He taught at the University of Cologne and eventually the University of Paris, at which point he took on in Cologne his most famous of students, which was, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas, who would then accompany him as another professor when they went to the University of Paris. And it was Albert the Great, along with, and subsequently with St. Thomas Aquinas. But Albert the Great is the one that brought back scholastic philosophy to the church. For a long time, the study of scholastic philosophy is a philosophy that is based on the philosophy of Aristotle and then Christianized to be made more perfect. And for a long time, it had been lost in the area of the church, because it had fallen into the hands and had become corrupted over time by the influence of the Muslims. And so the Christians oftentimes were Platonic philosophy based, and it was the Arabs that had embraced this idea of Aristotelian philosophy. Well, Albert the Great took that back in and reassessed it and corrected the errors and reapplied it to Christianity, and created a much firmer base of philosophy study, the scholastic method, the scholastic philosophy, that which the church still uses to this day, and had given that to the church. His talents eventually made it so that he was not bound to simply be locked into a university, although he would much rather that. Eventually he was made provincial of the Dominican order, and he would have to travel all about to the various monasteries that were under his guard there, and eventually it was put upon him by the Pope that he needed to become a bishop, and he was consecrated Bishop of Ratisbon, in which he performed the duties of that, all the while still teaching and still writing great extant works, in which it is unknown how he was able to devote so much time to writing and study as he did throughout the rest of his life. However, at the age of 73, I believe, he one day was preaching a sermon, and in the middle of the sermon, he suddenly was blank. He had no more thoughts to speak on, and he remembered from that message from all that time before, in which Our Lady promised that the wisdom that came down from heaven to him would one day leave him before he died. And so he declared in the middle of the sermon that my time is finished, and he sat back down, and a few days later he indeed ended his life and entered into eternity. So St. Albert the Great, most magnificent saint of ours, and we are reminded by him that truly that all of the world's knowledge, the things of the world around us, the sciences, the study of all the various subjects, Every aspect of that is connected with God. Why? Because God is truth. And so we should love every aspect of his creation. We should desire to know him more perfectly, even through those things of his creatures, in addition to knowing him himself more perfectly, so that one day when we realize that in eternity, we may realize that the bit we have learned here has helped us to get to eternity, but then we will find for ourselves a truth which far surpasses in anything we have ever known in this life. May God bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.